Welcome to another episode of Zero Velocity Podcast. I'm your host, Brad Thorpe. On today's episode, we're going to discuss something that touches pretty much all humans. We're going to talk about the aging of bone, the weakening of bone, and the negative effects of bone loss. The name that is given to this realm is osteopenia and osteoporosis. So in today's episode, Isometrics for osteoporosis. I was going to talk about bone health in general, but this is such a huge ordeal that faces a lot of people over the course of their life. One in every 2 women over the age of 50 fractures a hip. 1 in every 5 men over the age of 50 fractures a hip. And this is due to osteoporosis, which is a weakening of bone structure over the course of your life. It's traditionally measured by low bone density. And also what they're finding that it's related to low bone strength. Now, many of you out there are thinking, well, I don't have to worry about it. I'm in my 20s, I'm in my 30s, I'm in my 40s. Well, let me tell you, you can see all this gray here that you traditionally don't see. So I'm a 47-year-old male, so that means in about 3 years, my risk of fracturing a bone goes up significantly. Now, you think, it's only a bone fracture. What's that lead to? Well, it actually increases your likelihood of death. And the significance within 1 year of a fracture, and it's not just your femur or your arm, it's any bone they're finding. It could be a fracture of your lumbar vertebrae. It could be, one of the arm bones, your radius or ulna. So it's quite prevalent. And what we're going to do is you're going to pull up a quick little slide here. Because a lot of people, they don't understand the structures of the bone. They don't really understand that bones are fed by blood. You've heard the term bone marrow, and that's where oxygen, or your oxygen and hemoglobin specifically is made. And so let's pull that back up. And so what we want to just read for you, numerous studies provide or prove that mortality risk after hip fracture is increasing. This increase in mortality is not exclusive to hip fractures. It is also associated with vertebral fractures, in particular all major osteoporotic fractures, such as humerus fractures, pelvic fractures, distal end of femur fractures, and rib fractures, and at all ages. Moreover, second fracture results in an additional increase in mortality. And that is the Journal of Orthopedic Surgery and Research, effective 2019. So that's huge. That is absolutely huge. We can pull that down now. So if you guys think that you're immune, well, the risk of falling as you get older is significant. The #1 leading cause of hospital admissions amongst active seniors over the age of 60 is falls related to walking. And that doesn't mean you're going to break your hip every time or your arm, but it does create a significant risk. And we look at walking as paramount to the health and well-being of society, but yet it is the #1 leading cause of fractures associated with falling, which also increases your risk of mortality, as we just sort of looked at. So if we can start to explore this, and we can see the bone up there, and we can see that there's veins, and then there's arteries, and then there's nerves that go into it. Obviously, you got the bone marrow, you got the periosteum, you got the compound bone at the end, you got spongy bone inside. Now, one of the things that I'm going to talk about a fair bit today is your periosteum, and that's the outermost surface of your bone. And the reason that I'm going to talk about this is because this is how you transmit force into that bone via your muscular system. So when your muscles, just to give you a little bit about your osteotendinous junction, that's where the bone meets that tendon, and it forms a nice little blending of tissues. It's not just like, oh, I'm stuck here and that's it. The periosteum and the tendon, it sort of amalgamates into one cohesive connective structure. And that periosteum is pretty much synonymous with human bone. Almost every bone in your body is covered in it. And the reason for that is bone helps transmit force to create movement. So hugely important in the, well, being human, to be honest. And one thing, I'll pull up the next slide, just to give you a little bit more of an internal structure of the bone. You have these osteoblasts, osteocytes, osteoclasts, and that's the stuff inside the bone structure. And when you look at a bone traditionally, you'll see it almost like it's almost like a very spongy, and that's that sort of internal spongy portion of the bone. And when that starts to break down, and that's traditional with aging, and it's traditionally talked about, oh, it's related to poor iron. It's associated with your menopause if you're a woman, andropause if you're male. So it's that hormone responsibility. I'm going to throw something else into the mix today because this is traditionally not talked about in this area. I'm going to say it's related to poor isometric strength throughout a lifetime. And why do I say that? Well, it's not because I'm, heavily invested in isometric exercise. I'm heavily researched in the area. And when you understand how you apply force to structure, and you understand that bone responds to strategic adaptation of force into that structure, we can strategically start to grow bone with isometric-based exercise. And that is different than dynamic exercise, because dynamic exercise, when you're looking at motion-based exercise, moves. So your level of being strategic goes significantly down. It gets into the realm of guess, hope, and pray. I guess I'm working this area, I pray I'm working this area, and I hope I'm working this area. Now the thing is, when you move, you're no longer working where you thought you were. So that's why I state that. It's not to be offensive, but obviously there's people out there that are going to be offended by it. That's for you guys to deal with, not me. But when looking at isometrics, you can be so strategic in how you apply force to structure. You can grow bone by choice. It's that cool. And things that we have to look at if we pull up the next slide, just to give you guys an idea of when we start to hit peak bone mass, right? It's in our late 30s as traditionally in humans, and women it's actually before men. Now, you'll see on that graph that men have a superiority when it comes to bone mass. Well, we tend to be bigger, we tend to be stronger. Traditionally, we tended to exercise more, we lifted more weights, we did more farm work, we did more labor, all of these things. So I'm not going to buy into the realm that women suffer osteoporosis more than men only due to the fact that we have hormonal changes. I'm going to say osteoporosis is a lifestyle disease as much as it is a hormonal change and an aging disease. And the reason I state that is because women historically did less from a lifting weight perspective. So they're weaker, traditionally. And I'm not here to start a gender war or anything like this, but males tend to be stronger than women. That means they're putting more force every day into their bone. And we know that muscles grow and transmit force, or muscles transmit force into bone, which results in bone growth. So that's been studied and put forth. But here's a study that was put out by the Journal of Modern Rehabilitation. And I'm just basically just reading you the kind of the conclusion. This study compared strength and change in the thickness of the back extensor muscles during isometric contraction in healthy osteoporotic postmenopausal women and the relationship between these variables. The findings showed that isometric strength of the back extensors in postmenopausal women who have osteoporosis is lower than healthy women. So there's a direct correlation of what I'm talking about. Poor isometric strength is related to osteoporosis. So when you can start to understand that, and it's like, well, the women who had higher levels of isometric strength had less incidence of osteoporosis. That's amazing. The solution to a problem doesn't have to be complex. It can be as simple as adding isometric force into the equation. There was a gentleman by the name of Dr. Robert Swayze. He studied at UCLA. He was huge in the late 80s and early 90s in the world of osteoporosis. He was a celebrated physician, so much so that he invented a product called Osteoball. And there has been clinical research on the success of applying isometric force to bone structure. The product has been sold for 25 years at least. They have a clinic in Santa Monica, California. And the results have been pretty amazing for the individuals that use that product. More so the method. When you can start to look at the history of isometrics, both from a business side as well as an outcome side, you can start to see that it's been pretty extraordinary. One of the gentlemen who has really wholeheartedly jumped on the osteoporosis train is a guy named Dr. John Jaquish. And he got into this because his mom developed a severe case of osteoporosis. So he started studying absolutely everything, and he stumbled onto this piece of research that said high force, high rapid force created an osteogenic change within the matrix of the bone that led to an advanced rate of bone growth. He has a product that has now been picked up and partnered with Tony Robbins, you know, the guy who basically motivates the world to live a better life. So Tony Robbins joined up with OsteoStrong, and the traditional product was called biodensity. And what that did was they looked at 4 different exercises. And their protocol, which is scientifically shown to increase bone density anywhere between 7.9% annually and 16%, depending on the patient. Now, those benefits are remarkable. Now, let me tell you that they do 4 exercises once a week. Now, here's the kicker. It's maximum compressive loading is what they call it. So they push into an immovable object at a very high rate of speed. It is synonymous with doing what we would deem an explosive isometric. It's when you shove into an immovable object, very rapid, at a high rate of force, with the intensity of doing at a maximal exertion. Their protocol is 15 seconds times 4 exercises. So in 1 minute of maximum compressive isometric loading, the team at Biodensity figured out that you can increase your bone density by almost 8% per year, doing 1 minute of work per week. Now, when you start to explore that, and you think, well, who doesn't have 1 minute? Well, pretty much everybody on the planet. So that's kind of how easy it is to sort of help prevent osteoporosis. Now, there's obviously other factors and lifestyle factors, hormonal differences and stuff like that. But if you can increase your bone density by 8% with 1 minute, what happens if you do 2 minutes or 3 minutes or 4 minutes? I live in a world where I promote, basically 3 hours of isometrics a week. So that gets kind of interesting, and we see huge success with Isophit and bone growth. But it's not an infomercial for me. It's more just to talk about stuff. And we'll just pull up this next slide here. And this just goes through the different stages of, we were talking about that spongy bone earlier. So the healthy bone, you can sort of see there, it's a little bit thicker. The osteoporosis, you can start to see that spongy, the holes are getting a little bit more prevalent, and there's a little bit less of that sort of bone matrix in there. The severe osteoporosis, now that's getting pretty bad. And osteoporosis, obviously, is a disease where it increases bone weakness and increases your risk of breaking of bones. And now here's the interesting thing. So we'll look at the study. And this was about how you can strategically grow bone. So through the present result of this study and further use of the modeling tool, customized isometric exercises can be developed to target specific weakened or fractured prone regions of the bone. For example, if a region of the bone has become weakened, this modeling tool can be used to develop a set of joint angle and resultant forces that can significantly strengthen it. In particular, loading conditions are commonly encountered, such as the repetitive resultant forces of an athlete or due to particular occupations. Those loads can be stimulated to assess the effects they may have on the local strength adaptations and the developed counter methods, and developed to counter methods to adjust for any resulting local weakness. So what does that mean? That means I can strategically grow bone and create isometric-based exercises to target bone throughout your body. And as I said, so that was the Medical Stimulation Journal put out by SAGE. And this gets really, really, really awesome in the sense that we can now strategically start growing bone in humans. So let that resonate for you. So if you go to your doctor and you come back and you have a negative test, and they tell you that you're on the spectrum of osteopenia, which is the stage before osteoporosis, you can strategically make a decision, and we can help you with that. Now it gets interesting. So let's just pull up that next slide here. Because I discussed that it's not only women that have osteoporosis. Men get it as well. It's 1 in 5, so it's less common. And as I mentioned earlier, it's my belief that it's because of a lifetime of greater force adaptation to that, or force transference to that bone. But here we go. In summary, we've found that isometric muscle strength is an independent determinant of fracture risk in men. Right? And that's the Journal of Bone Mineral Research, and that was put out in 2016. So a lot of this research, because you guys don't look for it, or you're not well versed in the search button on Google, you might not look for it, or you get tied up with like just little sound bites. And obviously I just gave you a sound bite, but this comes from a study, and I'd be happy to share it with people. But when looking at it, you go, okay, it's an independent determinant of fracture risk. So what they're saying there is poor isometric strength increases your likelihood of fracture risk. And we've already discussed how that leads to mortality. Now it gets interesting because a lot of people don't know that bones require blood flow. And when you do too much, it doesn't necessarily increase blood flow. It might actually even hinder it. And that gets into the realm of dynamic exercise, right? There's going to be a lot of trauma to that bone structure that might cause a decrease in blood flow. Now, the interesting thing is, well, this study here basically looked at it, and then the results indicated that isometric exercise increased femoral blood flow from rest to low intensity exercise. But blood flow did not increase further with increasing intensity. So even high intensity exercise doesn't necessarily increase blood flow. So what you want to look at is lower intensity exercises, to maintain integrity of the bone structure relative to let's help it heal because it's getting more blood into the localized area, right? And here's a cool thing. So when we're looking at this, and this infograph is taken from the OsteoStrong website. So 1 in 2 women over the age of 50 will break a bone due to osteoporosis. That's insane. That is absolutely insane. 1 in 2, that's 50% of the population. So in Canada, as an example, that's roughly, 1 in 2, there's 19 million women. So they're not all over the age of 50. However, let's say there's a big chunk of it. So that's about 3 million women. Well, 4 million women will break a bone because of osteoporosis. A man over the age of 50 is more likely to break a bone due to osteoporosis than he is to get prostate cancer. Right? And if you're a man, obviously, you don't want prostate cancer. But to generate the adaptive response of bone, osteogenesis, the mechanical loading, sufficient magnitude, rate, and frequency of loading are necessary. Many animal studies show that loading must be dynamic, not static. So this is where the explosive isometric comes into play, right? So static holding, so I'm just going to stay there and do nothing, is significantly different than if I were to take my chair and just go boom into that, right? That impact and loading, and because of that stoppage, so we'll call that explosive isometrics. And that's how when we're using, the Isophit, that's how we load stuff. It's not just stand here and hold stuff and hope and pray that it's working, because it's just not that much force. You need that impact force in order to generate bone structure. Now, because I mentioned impact force, it's not about hitting an object, it's about accelerating into an immovable object, right? So contact surface first, then press out rapidly. Don't jam into it, because high probability you'll end up fracturing your bone, right? So because osteocytes are densitized due to repetitive loading, short bursts with intervals and rest, or for rest, are more beneficial than the same number of loads performed all at once. So repeated loading, right, over a greater period of time. We look at 180 repetitions per week. We don't look at thousands of repetitions when we're looking at our isometric-based protocols. And as we've stated, we have seen significant increases in bone density with a lot of our female clientele. Now, isometric exercise is not only effective for preventing reduction of bone density in injured limbs, but it also increases the density of the injured bone. So there's a ton of research out there that looks at isometric-based exercise and how it relates to bone loss. Is there a benefit to doing dynamic exercise? Absolutely. Is it the same? No. Is one more risk? Absolutely. We already mentioned the risk of falling with seniors increases with walking, let alone running, or the injury rate associated with lifting weights. I'm not here to say don't do those things, but what I am here to say is add isometrics. If your goal is to reduce the rate of osteoporosis, if your goal is to reduce the rate of risk, like fractures caused because of osteoarthritis or osteoporosis, isometrics has to be top of mind. It's super crazy effective. It's easy to do. You can use a wall, a tree, anything that's going to obstruct your movement pattern. And you can basically reduce your risk of developing one of society's most economically burdening diseases that affects 1 in 2 women and 1 in 5 men. Just want to thank our sponsors, Zenkai Sports and Kinvent and Isophit for sponsoring our show. A special shout out to our team at Isophit Media for producing the show. Now, we've aligned with these companies to get you guys a 10% discount. So if you go to their websites and you're looking to purchase, just use the the discount code Zero Velocity Podcast and save yourself 10%. Thank you guys. We'll see you guys next week.